It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Professor Arjen Wals, who is a Professor of Transformative Learning for Socio-Ecological Sustainability at Wageningen University. He is also the UNESCO Chair of Social Learning and Sustainable Development. Prof. Wals is also a visiting professor at the Norwegian Life Science University, where he supports the development of whole schools approaches and sustainability. His recent work focuses on transformative social learning in vital coalitions of multiple stakeholders at the interface of science and society. His teaching and research focus on designing learning processes and learning spaces that enable people to contribute to meaningful sustainability. A central question in the professor's work is how to create conditions that support, in brackets, new forms of learning which take full advantage of the diversity, creativity, and resourcefulness around us, but so far remain largely untapped in our search for a world that's more sustainable than the one that we have. So, he also hosts a blog, it's really quite informative, that signals developments in the emerging field of sustainability. You can find it on, it's www.transformativelearning.nl, and it is really very informative. The latest paper on there is Vocational Education for a Sustainable Future. So if you want a treasure chest on work that's related to the field, please go and have a look at that. So it's www.transformativelearning.nl. But without any further delays, I would like to invite Prof. Wals to address us on his theme for today, which is Cultivating Hope, Rethinking Education in Light of Global Sustainability Challenges. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. What a pleasure to be here in this scenic, beautiful, historic place that I don't know very well, even though I grew up in Leiden, not far from here. So that's a shame, but I'm here today, and so are you on a Saturday, a beautiful Saturday. I hope to have a somewhat hopeful story. Sustainability is often associated with doom and gloom. And something negative, and we need to kind of turn that around, I think. Before I start, I need to do something first. I'm gonna ask somebody in the front to unroll this very carefully and then hand it back diagonally to kind of in the back there. See how far we get, and then I'll explain later why we do this. And in case it's a shitty talk, you at least have plenty of paper. So, there we go. We'll get to that in a minute. So, first, current state of the world in a nutshell. I think I always do this, although most people in the audience typically know that the world is not in a very good space at the moment. And the IPCC report, the latest synthesis report, has a nice graphic that kind of illustrates quite well that different generations are being affected by climate change. I sometimes say runaway climate change. Some are more affected by this than others. I was born in the 1960s. And my life will be affected by climate change somewhat. It already is. We have some more extreme weather. Sometimes it's very dry. Sometimes it's rather wet. Sometimes it's unusually warm. We've had the last couple months again the warmest on record in this country. But always, wherever you go, You talk to people about the weather, there's always something extreme going on. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. And of course, there are people already today who are experiencing the consequence of climate change in far more severe ways, having to leave their homes, having to escape a flood, or not being able to farm anymore because it's too dry. So in some ways, I'm somewhat lucky to be in this country where we are relatively comfortable still. But my children were born in the 90s, and children today, you know, born now, they will live into the next century. And if it's going to be like 4 degrees rising, the consequences will be severe. Also, when it comes to migration, people will be moving around, and major ecosystems are shifting. Currents of oceans are part of that. Biodiversity loss is enormous. And we don't really know what the consequences will be when all these major systems that have been formed in 4.5 billion years are changing in just a few hundred years. And one single species is able to do that. That's quite remarkable, Homo sapiens. One phenomenon that I think is important to acknowledge as we work in schools, often more locally, is our sense of place is changing over time too. This is a famous study from the United Kingdom where they looked at how children at different generations connect with their street, their neighborhood, their local environment. And great-grandfather George, when he was 8 in 1919, he could wander and roam freely the neighborhoods for about, 6 miles around. And nobody would be worried about George, as long as he was home on time for dinner. And even if he wasn't home on time, they're still not worried. But every generation you see that space is shrinking. And nowadays young children in many parts of the world, they hardly go outside anymore. They don't have a connection with place, and they're more glued to the technology than to the physical space. And if you don't have a sense of place and you don't identify with your local environment, then why would you care for that place? There's no intrinsic connection. So how to restore that connection is part of the solution. Children won't remember their best day on YouTube. But you do remember if you were young, growing up, exploring, wandering freely, getting lost maybe, climbing trees, building tree huts. You remember that. And of course there are a lot of young children growing up in urban areas, sometimes in poverty, that never had that opportunity either. So we need to also be always, when I tell this story, I have to always tell myself, remember, you're from the Netherlands, you grew up in very privileged conditions. And we need to also be mindful of people elsewhere in the world, and even in the Netherlands, who do not have this type of history, childhood, that can bring this. And that's very formative. The loss of biodiversity, we now live in the 6th period of mass extinction, and it is going to have consequences already, and not just for the human species, obviously, also other species. You might be wondering, what's the airplane doing over here? You forgot to eliminate that when he was taking the screenshot. And at first I did eliminate it, and then I thought, oh, wait a minute, I'm serving the web for an article on biodiversity loss. This is in 2019, a while ago. And there's that little plane coming in from Austrian Airways. And while I'm looking for this, I'm being nudged to take the plane from Amsterdam to Vienna. And I was wondering, why is that? Well, at the time I was going to go to a conference in Vienna, and I'd been communicating also via Gmail. And, you know, I'm being followed. My mind is being mined, so to speak. So, we also live in a world where we're continuously nudged to live unsustainable lives in a way. That's made easy, while living a healthy life or sustainable life is made very difficult. And that, of course, needs to flip somehow. Sustainability, good health, citizenship, equity, equitable sharing needs to become the normal rather than the exception. This is not a scientific graph, but more intuitive, although we know biodiversity, there's lots of scientific evidence showing this, is rapidly declining, while at the same time consumer product diversity is rapidly increasing. And a lot of our education and innovation is actually accelerating this type of diversity, new products, new markets. A lot of brain power goes to coming up with new things that people will buy. This is just a random grocery store where they sell hair products also, and there's enormous variety of hair products and shampoos and nail products, deodorants, toothpaste. There's a lot of innovation, and it's accelerating in a way the economy, but it's also accelerating unsustainability. And a lot of the plastic packaging that you saw earlier is also disappearing. Sometimes it's burnt, incinerated, sometimes it becomes litter in neighborhoods, sometimes it ends up as plastic soup. And here we have somebody in Southeast Asia who's trying to make a living of the plastic river by finding plastics of certain value that he throws in the boat and can be sold somewhere on the market. And we could say, well, this is wonderful, this is entrepreneurial, good quality entrepreneurship. You could say this is adaptation, this is responding to a changing world. But is this a dignified, meaningful life? And where is the local knowledge about fishing? What happened to that? That's also become extinct. So we also see the wisdom of the elders is no longer relevant because the pollution is such that it's really altered the local environment in severe ways. To kind of compound the complexity around sustainability, we also have to deal with doubt about what is really going on, and some of that doubt is healthy. I think as educator we have responsibilities to critique, to question, and to sometimes raise doubt. But some of the doubt is cultivated intentionally to keep us from changing. And here are some myths used around climate change. Nowadays, I think, this is also a slide maybe 10 years old. More even, again, 2009. Nowadays, these myths are mostly debunked, and there's much more consensus in the society. But still, there's polarization, confusion, ambiguity. And how, as educators, do we deal with that polarization, ambiguity, and how do we overcome misinformation, propaganda, clickbait, sponsored content, and critical media literacy is a big part, I think, of sustainability education. This is a project from the European Union where they help people understand the different kinds of misleading information. And this is important because how to deal with confusion, ambiguity, uncertainty, and maybe anxiety about the future is becoming a more important task for educators today, I think. These are in Dutch, but these are headlines you can see all over the world. It's about a rising of fuel price. It's about alpine ski resorts, that's in English, pondering a future without snow. It's about refugees, overcrowding refugee centers in the Netherlands and the controversies. It's about nitrogen emission, agriculture affecting the quality of nature in Europe, in this country, all over the world. And so this is no longer in the margins of the media, it's becoming more in the mainstream. Well, in a way that's a good thing, I think. We talk more about it, even though people disagree about it, people talk about it, which they didn't do before, although a small group always has, since Limits to Growth, 1972, Club of Rome, goes way back. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1959, goes way back. It's not like this is all new. Those people from those times are saying, we've always been saying this, but finally more people are talking about it. To kind of illustrate the difficulty around sustainability and what is sustainable, and that there's no clear definitive answers to that question, so it's not like teaching photosynthesis or Newton's laws. this question, or statement, if we want to feed the world in 2050 with maybe 9 billion people on the planet, we need to use genetically modified organisms. That's the statement. Who would say makes sense? I'm leaning towards agreeing to this. Don't be afraid. See, there's already a kind of stigma around this, apparently. Usually I get some hints, but this crowd is like, no. No GMO. I once said genetically manipulated organisms, and then somebody corrected me. That was a biased term, manipulated. It's modified. Okay. Anyway, there are different ideas about how we can feed the world. Some people say we don't need GMO because we're already throwing away 1/3 of our food. If we wouldn't do that, we can already feed 9 billion. So let's just minimize food waste. Others say we need to stop eating meat, protein, transition towards plant-based food, can save lots of energy, can also save lots of water. It can also be much more mindful to animal well-being. It makes perfect sense, although here it says insect burgers, which could say that's not really plant protein. And for a while we could buy insect burgers in Dutch grocery stores about 5-10 years ago, but now they're gone. I don't know why, because I like them anyway. Then some are saying, we need drone agriculture, we need smart agriculture, precision agriculture, technology. It doesn't need to be GMO, which is messing with nature in a way, some people might say. But this is actually making sense. If we can really apply chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers in a far more efficient way, we don't need to use as much, and we grow high quality foods, and we can be very productive. We don't need GMOs. Others are saying the problem is not the production of food, it's the distribution. Food sovereignty, fairness, food justice, 1 billion people having not enough to eat, 2 billion people overweight and obese. That's where we need to look for solutions. And there's some truth. We need more literacy around food. People don't really consciously cook and buy and enjoy a meal, slow down while eating. We need to have different food cultures. So there's different ways of looking at this question, and they're all interesting to explore. And I think students need to engage with all these ways of looking at this issue from multiple perspectives, trying to connect the different approaches and also maybe critique the different approaches. And some might say it's not about just food, it's about a whole system. We need to have more local food. We need to green cities, urban agriculture, grow food on rooftops. We need to redesign cities. It's not just about food then, it's also about clean air, because if you grow vegetables in the city and the air quality is poor, it can be grown organically, but you better not eat the leafy vegetables or wash them very well. So then people start demanding clean air. And when people have a social garden in the community, it also leads to social cohesion. So it's not just about food, it's about water, energy, climate, cooling the city, and social cohesion, a whole system redesign. Some people call this more like a transition perspective. And then, of course, we as citizens are always confronted with lots of different messages. This is just logos about organic food, sustainable food, healthy food, and there are lots of them, and people don't, they don't know anymore what they mean, and they start doubting the authority of these logos. What logo do we trust? That's also a good question for students to investigate. Who came up with that logo? What interest groups are maybe behind it? What are the criteria that are being used? How do we determine whether something is trustworthy or when it's propaganda? Is it greenwashing or not? And how do we know? So when we talk about sustainability, in a time where it's easy to find quick answers, I used to say you could go to Wikipedia and get all the answers. Now I say you go to ChatGPT and you get all the answers. You don't have to spend a lot of time on these questions. You just find the answer and you hand it in. And sometimes teachers use ChatGPT to check the answers. So you get an interesting dynamic where we outsource our thinking to algorithms, which is a bit scary because these kinds of questions, they are complex, even wicked, people might say. There should be another sign, wicked without any right answers, because that's, I think, what often is the case. So I see sustainability as not so much a destination that you once will reach and then you can sit back and relax. It's a continuous quest. It's a continuous journey where we need to investigate, reinvestigate, recalibrate, and what might be sustainable today may turn out to be unsustainable tomorrow. And that means that doesn't mean that science is bad or governments cannot be trusted. It means that we're learning. And that we always need to be looking for a better way or a different way. And sometimes it's not about doing the things we do better, but doing better things. That's another. That has to do with values and principles. Of course, I think one part of the problem, some people say we live in the Anthropocene, the epoch, geological epoch, where one single species determines the course of the planet, Anthropocene, where others say, well, it's actually not all humans who are doing this. It's a certain way of thinking, a colonizing way of thinking. It is a Western way of thinking. It is capitalism underneath. It's the economic system that is reproducing this. So it should be called the Capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene. There's something to say for this. But this is, of course, we are in a system that does emphasize innovation, expansion, growth, extraction, exploitation. It's not about solidarity, community, empathy, changing perspectives, putting yourself in the minds of others, thinking about future generations. Those are kinds of qualities and competencies that we're not really cultivating very well in our schools and universities. So this kind of rat race is kind of promoted in subtle ways. You could say it's the hidden curriculum of schools, that we need to be resilient, we need to be able to always renew ourselves and grow personally. There's nothing bad about growth or innovation, but if it's always wanting to be better than you are, or if you're never happy with who you are or where you are, you're always looking for the next thing, then can you really be who you are? Or are you being, in a way, pushed all the time, which leads to stress, anxiety, frustration, and we need to kind of start questioning this kind of a narrative, which is why you see a lot of people yearning for meaning, spirituality, yoga, meditation. All these things are bubbling up in all kinds of parts of society that are, in a way, a response to this. And a lot of young people, I already mentioned it, in this part of the world, but I think all over the world, are anxious about the future. I know in Scandinavian countries, in Northern Europe, a lot of young women do not want to have children because they're not so sure if it's a good idea. So how do we deal with this feeling of anxiety, and how do you maintain hope on a I won't say a dying planet. The planet will go on, even without us. Maybe we'll go on better without us. But the point is, how do we create hope in times of, well, unsustainability? How can we make it attractive, inspirational? How can we show examples of transitions that show that we can live more lightly on the planet and more equitably on the planet? So, what does education have to do with all this? Well, first, this is of course what UNESCO and many organizations are always saying. Education is transformative. Education can help build societies. It's a critical component, and many of you are in education for this reason. But we must also think about what does education itself strengthen in society, what does it maybe silence or weaken in society. If we don't reflect on that, on education itself, what kind of education, then it risks, as American Professor David Orr, emeritus from Oberlin College in Ohio says, then we risk that education creates more effective vandals of the earth. It's provocative. He also says the people who have the biggest ecological footprints on the societies are not, on this earth, are not the people growing up in the slums of Mumbai with very little formal education, with lots of education, because they've learned an awful lot by experience. But it's people with PhDs, master's degrees, and bachelor's degrees. In other words, the people who are educated the most tend to have the biggest ecological footprints. So more education doesn't always mean better. So education for all is important, but the real question is what kind of education for all? So that's SDG 4. We'll get to that in a minute. There are different streams, and you're aware of this as educators. There's, in many countries, a culture of focusing on cognitive capacities, the basics, that what we can measure on tests, culture of testing, measurement, accountability, which stands in the way of this more localized curriculum where existential questions that people struggle with in their everyday lives become the driver of education rather than, say, a national curriculum with learning goals that have been predetermined by experts that are tested by specialists who are good at making tests. But they're not so mindful of those capacities, social-emotional learning, embodied forms of learning, that cannot be measured so easily. And we know that not everything that can be measured counts. And not everything that matters can be counted. So, and this is Abraham Maslow who came up with that a long time ago. So we often have the culture and the tools of measurement drive what goes on in many schools. Which means often that teachers do not have the autonomy and the freedom to kind of teach. Young people are rising in a way. They're beginning to say, what I learn in school is not relevant to my life. It's not responsive to the world that's going on. It's not responsible in light of the possibilities for future generations to live, my generation as a young person then, to live, and it's not reimaginative in providing creative, hopeful futures. So a diploma, it says here, but no future. And I think this is, as educators, we need to think seriously about what is the implication of this. Here, not far from here in The Hague, there's the A12, Dutch people know what I'm talking about, where Extinction Rebellion has been blocking in the fall this highway to protest the 40 or so billion euros the Dutch government uses to subsidize fossil fuels, while at the same time also having all kinds of programs to accelerate solar energy and things like that. So it's contradicting movements in a way. And here we also see scientists, you could maybe recognize me, who are participating in a side event. So I wasn't blocking the highway, just to be sure. But there was a side event on education and sustainability. And we see more and more also in education movements of teachers, of professional organizations like yours, engaging with this topic. Like we must do something that is more than, say, project-based learning. It is really also underpinned with this moral compass of not unwillingly accelerating the economy, but also building capacity for living more sustainable lives. And some schools, this is from Stephen Sterling from the UK, years ago there was a kind of a group that was in denial, that would say, well, sustainability, it will blow over, and something else will come up. So we're not going to really engage with this. That was a significant group, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Now you don't see that as much. Stephen Sterling calls that denial. The second response was, okay, it sounds like this is important. Society wants us to pay attention to this. We should at least do some recycling, or maybe have a project week on climate or something like that. He calls that add-on. So, and sometimes green gloss. So, okay, sustainability, we got that covered. We have it in our annual report, and so you can tell parents we pay attention to that. It can be important as a starting point, so I don't want to dismiss it. Then the third is built in. Okay, if this is serious, then we need to look at our curriculum. Where do we have emerging topics like the circular economy? Where is it in our education? Biomimicry, where do we deal with that? Plastic soup. Do we do that, something with plastic soup in chemistry education? Mathematics. Can we teach social justice by the numbers? Exponential growth of plastics in the ocean. Can we use mathematics to understand that better? IPCC report, the statistics in the IPCC report. We need statistics to understand statistics if it's used in a good way. Can we use environmental sustainability issues as a meaningful context for teaching and learning? Should we not, as a school, also think about our own energy use and water use and how we use the space around the schoolyard? So now you're starting to really build it in. And the last response is the most radical, where you say, well, if it's about new competencies like anticipatory thinking, systems thinking, action competence, trying to make change in yourself, in your community, then we really need to rethink how we teach and learn. We need to think about outdoor learning, place-based learning, social learning, transformative learning. And maybe the structure of our schools and the way we assess is not right for this time. Now that's the most difficult. Ideally, you would start a new school, design it differently with new architecture. So a nice book on that on the table there. Redesigning schools so that you have places that invite connections, invite relations with the local environment, with the green spaces. A deep democracy in schools so that the school becomes like the beating heart of the community. A place where people want to work and want to learn instead of a place where people dread going to, which is often the case at the moment. So a transition, not just, it cannot be business as usual, but it can also not be education as usual. Kate Raworth, just checking who knows Kate Raworth. Yeah, one hand. Oh, two. So a few hands. She's an economist from the UK. And she came up with this model, the donut economy, which I think is a powerful model. It's kind of a metaphor, where she says we need to learn to live within the donut. The outside, she calls the ecological ceiling, or the planetary boundaries. So you think about oceans, you think about climate, you think about nitrogen cycles, biodiversity. You cannot overstep those, otherwise you're messing with Mother Earth. And that could lead to major problems, as we are already seeing. And the Stockholm Resilience Center is looking at these planetary boundaries, and many of them we've already overstepped. She calls that overshoot. And then at the same time, she says, a lot of people are forced to live unsustainably because they don't have a social foundation. They're poor, or they don't have good education, or there's no social equity or voice. So you need to have that social foundation as well. And if you don't have that, it's shortfall. And the Sustainable Development Goals, how many of you have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? That's more. Yeah, I always assume everybody has heard of them. That's not true. I mean, more people have heard of the SDGs than of the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. So in some ways, I think there's progress, because the Sustainable Development Goals seem to appeal and connect more than the Millennium Development Goals. But anyway, there's these 17 goals, education being one of them, quality education, that connect, I think, with the donut, some more on the inside and some more on the outside. And we should also be critical of these goals. That's part of education too. When there's a goal, let's see, where is it? Well, number 8, decent work, it says, and economic growth. Then I'm thinking, why not decent work and a circular economy? Why is growth always an inevitable part of it? Sometimes growth is important, but sometimes contraction. If you look at nature, you have the spring and you have the summer where there's growth and expansion and renewal, but you also have the fall and the winter where there's decay, death, decomposition, slowing down. They're part of the cycle, but in our economy we ignore fall and winter. So it should be more balanced, a dynamic equilibrium. So we need to be critical. It says no poverty, number 1, no poverty. It doesn't say no extreme wealth inequality, which would be more effective in fighting poverty, but that's controversial. No, So we need to be critical of that. And when we ask the question, what is education for? I think Gert Bista, Dutch education philosopher, quite well known internationally also, he talks about these 3 goals of education. Socialization has to do with the kinds of social norms and values, cultural values that we find important in society that we want to hand over in a way. Qualification, that's where we focus on the most, he says, is the skills, competencies that we need to be successful in life. And subjectification, that's what we ignore the most, he says, is about personal development. Who am I in this world? Who am I becoming? Am I becoming who I want to be? Or am I nudged to become something else? So that has to do with the personal inner sustainability, I sometimes call it. But what we need to add to this, I think, is maybe a critique or a suggestion, is that we need to think about these 3 within the donut. So eco-subjectification. What does my subjectification mean for the possibility of others to also have this subjectification? Or the subjectification, and now it gets really tricky, of the earth. If our becoming interferes with the becoming of the earth, then who are we as a species to mess with that? So we need to also think about the boundaries in which we live or need to live. Okay, the last part. How am I doing? Okay, so I'll make it then, because we have a whole toilet roll to discuss. Where is it? How far did it get? I just wonder. Oh, okay, that's a pretty... okay, good. And it's still not broken. That's fine. So, this picture I always love because it tells a story. You see on the left side kind of the engineering way of thinking. At strong engineering universities like Delft, which is one of the strongest engineering universities in the country, maybe the world even. We're very good at dissecting the world, dividing it in variables, subjects, categories, boxes. We're very good at making distinctions and drawing boundaries. But we've lost the ability to see connections, to establish relations, to see that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, system thinking. This relational way of being in the world that young children, I think, in a natural way have. They see the world as how it unfolds in front of them, using all the senses, through play, discovery. In some ways, they are better at seeing in a holistic way than we are. And we lose that ability. The more time we've spent in school and university, the more we lose that ability. Not to dismiss all this. The fact that I can talk to you through the microphone and that we have our smartphones, it's all the result of this type of thinking. So it's not, it's quite remarkable. But it lacks in balance. We need to complement it with this more relational way of thinking and learning and living. That could be a key to sustainability. So how do we bring in these more relational ways of knowing and being as a stepping stone for our schools, our teaching and learning? Well, one way that is more connecting with the stage 3 and 4 of Stephen Sterling, the built-in and the whole system redesign, is what's called the whole school approach. And the whole school approach basically saying we need to, as a school, have a vision, a kind of ethos, a moral compass. What do we want to strengthen in the world? What might we be wanting to critique? What do we want to preserve and sustain? I think sustainability is to do with what is it that needs sustaining, but also what needs disrupting. And the last question we don't always ask, because we are often stuck in systems and routines and habits that are hard to break. So we need to disrupt those. And so disruptive capacity building, that's a kind of an odd word, going against the grain, questioning the normal, making the common less common, sometimes referred to as resistance pedagogy, is often missing in our schools. But so there needs to be a vision on this type of learning and what is needed and what kind of space is there for subjectification for our students. And then around you have these different petals of the flower. Some have to do with professional development, not just of staff, of teachers, but also of school leaders and people cleaning the schools, working in the canteen, maintaining the grounds. That's also staff, but we hardly ever talk about that staff as also needing professional development. Pedagogy and learning, institutional practices. Do we live in a way as a school in a more sustainable way? Do we make our own school and school life in school and around school as a subject of our own teaching and learning and research? Or not? I'll get to that in more examples in a minute. Curriculum. What kind of curriculum do we need? And the community connections. How do we connect with businesses, local government, NGOs, elderly people in the community? What can we learn together? So curriculum, typically these schools that we work with, and I work with 4 of them in Norway at the moment, but in the Netherlands there's also more and more schools looking at a more localized, place-based curriculum, green school grounds, and a whole subject approach, so that you look at chemistry education, that you also bring in biology when you talk about plastic soup and the different kinds of plastic and how they break down and what they do in terms of toxification, how they affect life in water. Then biology enters too. But if you want to know how did it travel to get into the ocean, you may also want to look at currents, ocean currents, and you might also want to look at geography. So you can start bringing in the different disciplinary perspectives so that you get this kind of a whole subject approach, in case a whole school approach is a little too far-fetched. Teachers still have a lot of space. Using the arts, the plastic-free zone, this is some work students made in one Dutch school. This is an example of a curriculum called About Plastic Solution. So they talk about synthetic sand. They just take 1 square meter and start filtering it and finding all these small pieces of plastic, identifying the plastics, identifying where does it come from, identifying solutions, also looking for plastic in our own kitchen, in our own bathroom, in our own toothpaste, in our own bodies. Is there plastic in our bodies? There is. How much? Is it a problem? Yes or no? Well, that's all to be investigated. You are what you eat. Etc. How do other species, how are they affected by plastics? So it's not just the human that we're interested in, also the non-human. Local sustainability investigations, looking at water, looking at biodiversity in communities, but also at inequality in communities. Certain neighborhoods have lots of electric cars, lots of charging stations, lots of solar panels, and others don't. Why is that? Let's explore. Is it an elitist thing, sustainability? How can it become more mainstream? How do we deal with inequality and sustainability? And this is citizen science. This is in Lesotho, in South Africa, near South Africa, within South Africa. Looking at waterborne diseases and looking at biodiversity, benthic organisms as indicators for water quality. Upstream to downstream, different schools, mapping the whole watershed, identifying where do we see a rise of fecal coliform and waterborne diseases, what's the cause, what can we do about it, working with local government, local businesses. And it becomes more meaningful and alive. Pedagogy and learning, well, of course, you in Montessori schools, you've already, in a way, excelled in innovative ways of teaching and learning, I would say, but inquiry-based, values-based, a pedagogy of care, where people actually, students take care of a place, of a piece of land, of a piece of ground, something in the school, become responsible for that, maintain it. Place-based learning, system thinking, I'll do an example of that in a minute, and citizen science, also a kind of pedagogy, I think. So schools can become vibrant learning spaces and places. This is in Hasselt, Belgium, a school ground which is completely converted into a place that has been co-designed with the children, where there's lots of outdoor activity nowadays, lots of biodiversity increase, where also different groups in society and parents want to host birthday parties in the weekends because it's such a nice space. So it becomes a living space instead of a dead gray space where nothing ever happened, maybe some bullying because there's nothing else to do, which often happens. And when school grounds are kind of desolate places that are gray, that don't afford many different kinds of activities. This is an example of students in a vocational school in the Netherlands. This recycling, this is not so new, many schools have this, but what is nice about this example is that they're building this themselves, and they came up with the science, and they came up where to put it in the school, so that it became a system that was designed by the students themselves and built by the students themselves, and there's you have a different connection with that system then. The relational learning, this is just a very quick example because I know we're approaching the end now. Here you see in the middle one bag of tea. And we could take anything. I could have taken this thing or the glass or whatever. The phone is very interesting, old cell phones. Put it in the middle, ask, what's in it? Where does it come from? How is it used? What does it do to you? And here you can look at the resources, you have the nylon bag, you have the tea inside, you have the string, you have the staple and the little carton, lots of different materials. Energy goes in it, water goes in it, urine comes out. What happens to the urine? Where does it go? So you can do a whole life cycle analysis of this whole cup of tea and then try to connect it with all the SDGs. Now, some are easy, like climate action, energy, good health and well-being. But it gets trickier when you say, okay, gender. What does gender have to do with this bag of tea? Any thoughts? Gender in a bag of tea? Huh? Yeah, well, picking of the tea, mostly women. Is there equal pay in the whole chain? Let's check that. Companies that own tea, like Nestle, who runs those companies? I mean, you could draw the boundary where you want to draw it, but you could draw it also around gender. Or strong institutions, like the logos, the certification of tea, fair tea. How does that go, the certification? Who trusts the certification? How is it done? Are those strong institutions behind it or not? So all the SDGs are connected to this bag of tea. And I think that's also part of sustainability, that the whole sustainability puzzle is really in your hand, if you know what to look for and to look for it. And when I presented this a while ago in an online meeting, somebody in the chat said, we've actually developed a whole curriculum around tea. And they sent me a link to this site. I looked it up, and I couldn't believe it. So T and SDG 1, T and SDG 2, T and SDG 3. And there's lots of information behind it. Now, I don't think tea is necessarily the best topic for, say, high school kids. They're not all tea drinkers. So you need to maybe take a Red Bull or something like that and do the same thing. The institutional practices. Do we really enact sustainability or just talk about it? We should be aware of the inconsistencies between what we say and what we do. And use that as a starter, not as a conversation stopper, but as a conversation starter. Where are those inconsistencies, and how can we bridge the gap between acting and doing? And trying things out. Making the school as a place where you experiment with solar and with water and with green. Monitor what's working, what's not working, how can we improve. Those are really essential. I come from Wageningen. One of our former students, Joanna, became teacher of the year a couple of years ago. She left the school, Panterijn, Montessori school, to become a farmer. But she also started what is called Planterijn, which is an outdoor space, an outdoor classroom where they're also growing vegetables. There's a campfire, people can slow down and sit. And it's like a living outdoor place where they can walk to. And that's just a little thing, but it's a major thing. They're going to remember that instead of the YouTube. So the greening of school grounds is a big part of it. Vintage clothing fairs in schools. 10, 15 years ago, nobody would wear second-hand clothes, certainly not teenagers. Now it's kind of a hype. Repair cafes. Fixing old things. Having your physics teacher part of it, maybe. Fixing, developing an appreciation for matter. Matter matters. You have a different connection with something when you carefully choose it or build it or fix it. Different from when you go online, order it online, put it in the shopping basket, push a button, and the next morning it's delivered. You don't have a real connection with that. And if you lose it, it's got lost, you order a new one. And that's the kind of consumerist mindset that we have developed, instead of a more relational mindset where we have connections with things and we care about these things. And it makes us proud when we can fix them. Healthy food in school. What are we eating in school? What kind of snacks do we provide? Do we want that? Bring in the students, have a conversation about this, let them investigate. How can we change? Do we want to change at all? I mean, maybe they don't, but have that conversation. This is my old school in Leiden, my high school. Now it's called Da Vinci College. It had a different name when I went there. They weren't known for sustainability when I went to school. In fact, I didn't learn anything about sustainability in my school that I can remember. So I got it from somewhere else. And that's sad in a way. But they put solar panels on the roof, which is also not unusual. But what was unusual is that the students asked for it. The school said, okay, you figure it out. How many do we need? How much surface do we have? How many panels? How much power? Should they be positioned relative to the sun? Who do we pick to install them? Should it be South Korean panels or Chinese panels? Does it matter? Are all panels sustainable, or are some more sustainable than others? It became a big project. And eventually they were allowed to also help install the panels with the contractor who got to do the job. And then it starts living, it becomes a project, and then they wanted to do more, and they had a monitoring system showing how much does this generate in terms of energy, but also in terms of money, and how can we then reinvest the money that we save. So it became kind of a whole system against sustainability projects. That also is a bit community connecting, get subsidies from the government, you have to work with local companies that can install panels. So you need to go outside of your comfort zone as a teacher, as a school, as a student, to go into the community and broker these kinds of relationships that can lead to this vibrant coalition of multi-stakeholders, as you said in the beginning. So I'm wrapping up. Shared use, I already mentioned it, that the school, the community becomes a place, the school becomes a place where people want to go to. They want to have parties in the weekend or in the evening. Other organizations, NGOs that you work with, they want to use the space in the evening. Then you have to think also about how do you keep it clean and who's responsible for what, but it's all part of that. Capacity building is the teacher education, teacher training, but as I said, it's also the other staff that needs to be. What competences do we need if we want to do systems thinking or connect with the community, or different forms of assessment, socio-emotional learning, embodied learning? How do we foster that? How do we know it's working? Can we measure it, or is there a way to at least make it believable that something is happening. And sometimes you just have to observe to see this is working. There's no hard evidence, but anybody observing sees, oh, there's something going on here. Not sure what it is, but it's working. That sounds a bit, from a scientist, coming from a scientist, it sounds a bit counterintuitive maybe, but I think science too is shifting towards maybe not so much evidence-based science, but much more maybe evidence-informed science, where evidence is not necessarily scientific proof. It's also using the assessment of others who have different ways of knowing, different ways of looking, different ways of seeing, and recognizing that there's not just scientific knowing, but other ways of knowing, including indigenous ways of knowing, that can be very helpful in assessing if something is happening or not. This is the flower in Norway, teachers in Norway. They have one teacher who's responsible for the kind of development of this whole school approach. They get 1 day a week to do this, so it's quite luxurious to have this. And the schools make a network together, a professional development network, and they work with the local university to kind of develop this integrated approach to sustainability. And sometimes it's called to citizenship, global citizenship, to a healthy school. The label, I don't think, matters all that much. If it's sustainability, health, citizenship, climate, the point is this more relational, critical way of being in the world, where we take more advantage of the local community and the diversity that's all around us. And we try to create hopeful, inspiring practices of that we can make a change in ourselves and in the world around us. And small usually wins. If you can do this in meaningful, small ways, it can accelerate and move from the niche to the mainstream. So vision and ethos, I put it in the middle, in the flower. It's important, but you could do any of these flower petals in the middle, depending on where you're most comfortable. But these are just some questions that need to be asked. I won't repeat them because we're out of time. So, just to end, I think in the end it takes a whole child in a whole school, in a whole community, to create that network, that fabric of relationships and care, where there's also an underpinning moral compass of wanting to do good in the world, wanting to be sensitive to other species, other generations, and learning these kinds of competencies that are needed in this world in turmoil. This is from UNESCO. It's a way of drawing this whole school approach, and you recognize all the themes that I talked about, I think. The experimenting with sustainability, the greening of the school grounds, the different forms of learning, democracy is in the school, inclusiveness, it's all part of a healthy, vibrant school. The toilet roll. Okay, where you have the beginning. Yeah. So, and where's the end? Okay. That's the end. So if you so this toilet roll typically has 220 sheets. Yeah, on average. We have 4.4 billion, I said it already, years of history. Each sheet is 20 million years. Yeah. So 10 sheets ago. So you are at the beginning, but you're at the end. So 10 sheets back, that's when the dinosaurs started roaming, 200 million years ago. That's like this much, this whole line. The last 200,000 years you have in your hand, it's less than 1 centimeter. It's like 1 finger. That's the last 200,000 years. If you go to the last 2,000, where modern humans started emerging, that's less than 0.1 millimeters. So just to give you a sense of time, you know, we are here in this whole long history of the entire Earth, and this last little bit we're doing something to the earth that is significant. And the question I think that we have is whether we can use all the creativity and wisdom and smart people that we have on this planet, indigenous, local, scientific, in order to turn around the current trajectory. And we have a window to do that. But the window is shrinking, and we must act now. Because if we don't do, then we may end up with an eco-totalitarian regime where strong leaders tell us how to live our lives ecologically, if we're lucky, because at least they would care about the ecology. But then there's not a lot of space for democracy, agency, and being human. So that's the risk. But we have time to learn our way out of this. But the time is also shrinking. So, I'm going to skip that. And I think it's also good to recognize that education is shifting, but it's in the whole society. I want to be optimistic. I don't think pessimism is going to save the world. But you see this in food, in governance, you see it in energy, you see it in spirituality, you see it also in economy, where business schools are rethinking their models. And altogether, I think there is something you might call a sustainability movement. There are other movements going in the other direction. I'm aware of that, but I don't want to focus on those at the moment. I do think that in the end, these will be getting more traction, and hopefully Montessori schools will play a role in being a catalyst for this kind of a transformation. So, I'm not going to read this because reading is, who reads these days anyway? So I'm just going to say thank you and ask for any questions that you may have. This is Banksy. You want me to go back? Okay. If you want to take a picture. Oh, some guideposts. Yeah. People do want me to read them. So these are just some. I think the last one, replace a culture of fear and powerlessness with a pedagogy of hope and space for action. That's probably fits well with your theme today. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Professor Wals for that really enlightening presentation, sharing. We're literally just on the sheet, or are we in the something or other? There we go. What we'd like to do is, I know we've shot a little over time, but I think if we could just take a couple of questions or comments, if you could keep them brief, please. But the professor has agreed to take a couple. So if you have please just raise your hand and let's get the mic to you. There's a microphone coming.
Don't throw it away. Cut it up and take a piece off. It's bleached.
Okay, I'll give the mic back to you.
Yes, simple but I guess difficult question. You addressed the topic about economic growth that is sustainable or unsustainable. How would you address the topic of population growth?
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, we have enough for all, even if it grows the population. I think often population growth is used as, well, that's the real problem, as a way to kind of shift the responsibility away from the system or from ourselves. If we could address population growth, then we wouldn't be in this mess. So if you put, I think it's a very interesting topic, because I think in our part of the world there is a decline. People don't want children. And a lot in other parts of the world there's growth also because there's no good retirement system, and you rely on your children for your retirement. So you need to have many. Some might die, so you better have a few extra. I mean, it's culturally different. It's complicated, but we can. I think we have the resources, and we have this the circular idea that we can already feed 9 billion people. It's too easy to say population growth is the problem. It's more wicked than that. But so it's good to address that question, because I think also a lot of students will ask the same question. Isn't the problem economic growth, population growth. I think it's definitely, I wouldn't say it's going to solve the problem. It's a deeper thing. It's usually a symptom of something.
Thank you so much for this answer. I like the way you say it's too easy to blame the population growth. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to ask, is there one more? We have time for one more. Sorry, at the back there.
I just want to make one comment. I mean, the issue of population growth is tied to social inequity, right? Why do people have more children? Because so many children die. Why do they die? They don't have access to the healthcare system. So it's all a mesh.
Yeah.
Talk later. I just wanted to. I'm Anu from India. So I just wanted to share two examples of youth taking up matters in their hands. In 1988, a group of students from Ladakh, which is a very remote part of India, till 1960s there were no roads to Ladakh. If you Google, you'll find that they're right up in the high Himalayas. It's a dry desert with very little water. And a group of students started something called Students Educational and Cultural Movement of Ladakh. It's called SECMOL in short. And they the rate of students passing their matriculation was 5%, 5 out of 100 every year. And after the movement started, and they started with local languages, local culture, made a different kind of architecture for their schools. I don't know whether they knew of Montessori or not, but they were all boys in their late teens and 20s who started this. And now 95%, 95 out of 100 students pass their matriculation exams. And it's an experiment to watch. I wanted to suggest to you that you can just check what they have been doing. They have been protesting these days. It's a very massive protest. Almost everyone in Ladakh is participating in that, but that's a political question. Now, the other example I want to give you is a very living, continuing example of something we call nonviolent economy. And groups of students have started this, young people in late school and early college have started these little groups of nonviolent economy where is happiness sustainable? So they are looking at this question of sustainable happiness. And maybe you would want to look that up too. We can discuss it later.
Yeah, no, I think we need good examples. We need best practices. And we also need and I like good examples, but one thing that I would like to add, that best practices can also be failed practices when they are reflected upon as why didn't it work? What worked against us? Where did the resistance come from? What can we learn from the resistance? Because often the practices are somewhat, I'm not saying that this is romanticized at all, but often best practices are kind of romanticized, inspirational, that's important, feel-good stories that we need, but we also need to have why didn't things work sometimes the way we were hoping they would, and how do we deal with the resistance, so we can also learn from failed practices as reflexive practices that people have really thought through why didn't it work and what would we need to do. I think it also helps people in some ways more than the inspirational stories. We need both. We need the balance between the two.
Thank you so much. There's so much more to be said. I mean, we don't only have sustainability embedded in our strategic document moving to the end of 2028. We're really intentional about doing it. Very briefly, in the emergency response model that we're busy developing, we've been really intentional about looking at how that implementation targets each of the 17 SDGs. So watch the space for more from us. I really just want to wholeheartedly thank Professor Wals one more time on our behalf. I believe he is a fan of film, or so Yoko was telling me, and this is just a little something for us, and I hope that you enjoy it. Thank you so much. Thanks a million.